Hello. I'd like to talk to you today about early modern aesthetic theory, and specifically I'd like to talk to you about it in light of the second of the great philosophies that were dominating the philosophical world, the intellectual world at the time that early modern aesthetic theory was coming about, namely empiricism. British empiricism is sometimes called. I think that as much as it's the case that the empiricists don't offer quite as much to the overall development of aesthetic theory as, say, German idealism or a lot of the Romantic thinkers do a little bit later on, a century later, they have far, far more impact than do the rationalist thinkers that they're sort of their rivals at the time, as it were. And because of that, there's quite a bit more to say about from the empiricist point of view. But in order to get that, I need to give you a little bit of background as far as what British empiricism is, and then I want to pick up some of the themes that come from this. So a little about empiricism. First of all, empiricism, like rationalism, is one of these early modern philosophies that focuses primarily on epistemology, theories of knowledge, how we come to know what we know, the emergence of the nature of mind, what exactly is a mind, those kinds of things. But the way that it does it is, rather than focusing on the role of reason and simply the internal operations of the mind itself, it focuses on the idea that our mind comes to have its contents fundamentally through sense experience. Sense experience isn't all that makes up the mind, but it certainly makes up the content of the mind, the internal operations of the mind, organize that sense experience. And that as we come to think and understand things about the world, really what we're doing is going through a process of picking up new things, reflecting on previous sets of ideas, trying to refer back to ideas that we've had before, remembering, having a lot of these ideas in a state of decay, that is, that our senses become less and less impressed upon our mind and fall away. But it's you have in this basic sort of way a sense that our mind and our ideas don't come from the internal powers of reason itself. There are no innate ideas, the way Descartes and a number of other rationalist philosophers supposed, sort of woven into the mind. Instead, what there is a passivity and a receptivity to the powers of objects in the world, and for our capacity to receive these and have senses about them. One more thing, too, that comes from this that's worth noting before we get into the aesthetics specifically is that this has a big, big impact on value judgments, both ethical value judgments and aesthetic value judgments for the empiricists. Because if there's no innate ideas, if there's no basic way in which the mind fits together with these things, then there's very much a sense that all of our sense of value comes from the way in which our mind puts ideas together and how it responds to these, either to the senses it immediately gets or reflects upon those senses. And responds in what way? In whether the reflection produces pleasure or pain. In other words, for most empiricists, you want to talk about value judgments, either the good or the bad in ethics, or you want to talk about the beautiful or the disgusting in aesthetics, these sorts of things. What you're talking about are fundamentally questions of pleasure and pain. Now, like I said, as much as there's no one broad aesthetic theory within the empiricists, you can tell just by what their ideas are that everything comes from these sense perceptions. They're going to be way, way, way more receptive to aesthetic ideas, aesthetic experience than the rationalists were. It just plays a bigger role in their philosophizing. And so what I want to do is I want to lift up some of the central themes that they wanted to work on, that intrigued them and that they were happy with developing. First one, an idea that does get some play in in the rationalists certainly, but is much more important, I think, in the empiricists, is the idea of imagination, or fancy, as it's sometimes referred to by them. Imagination is what we are working on and with art. It's this reconsideration, this playfulness, this way in which the mind, in all of its collecting and testing and considering and reorganizing and all the different things that it's doing, is trying out different sets of ideas. Remember, our ideas are being constructed by the contents of by the operations of our mind. It's like, oh, I don't know. It kind of reminds me of a bunch of little workers who are carrying boxes and trying to repack them all the time within this gigantic room that's called our mind, right? And each of these boxes is an idea, and we are reorganizing and resetting them and trying to fit together in various ways. Well, in addition to using it in a way where we simply try to figure things out, we can also play with these ideas. We can craft novel associations of ideas according to our fancy, right? Or we can develop entirely new and novel patterns of these ideas. And the thing is, as we go through and create these ideas, as we go through and consider these novel and playful organizations of these senses, it elicits a kind of pleasure or delight within us. In other words, when we use our imagination, when we play with our fancy for the empiricists, one of the things that becomes so impressive for them is that there is a kind of delight in doing this in itself. And this is one of the basic things that's worthwhile about aesthetic theory. You don't hear that really with the rationalists, and you don't really hear it with the Neoplatonists and earlier thinkers either. There's some of that, I suppose, when you go all the way back to someone like Aristotle, something like that, when he talks about tragedy and the poetics, not exactly the same thing. You have a certain sense of this with some Roman commentators, but for the most part, this is a new idea. At least it's a recrafting of some very old ideas in such a way that we hadn't really seen them or recognized them before. It's an important point in the birth of modern aesthetic theory. The role of imagination and the pleasure and delight that it elicits in us because of our epistemology. Second idea is the idea of taste. This is probably the idea that in aesthetic theory that the empiricists are most famous for. And it's interesting because it's such a modern idea in a lot of ways, and yet today, despite how recent it really is, we just take it for granted. Let me tell you what I mean by that. When I talk to students about aesthetics, right, aesthetic theory and aesthetic ideas, what is art, these sorts of things, you will almost always, very early on in the conversation, get them saying, oh, well, art is really whatever we decide art is, or whatever tickles your fancy with it. They'll say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that it's a matter of one's taste. And there's an assumption that that's sort of always the way that it's been, that people have always just had their own private tastes about things, and that's really what makes art, and that's always what makes art, and that's how it is. Well, if you think about the earlier aesthetic theories that were out there, of course there was an element of taste. I mean, there's been some way in which we lift up one set of aesthetic ideas and experiences and downplay other sets of ideas and experiences. There's always been criteria for that. But the interesting sort of thing is that was always seen as sort of a point or a road mark on the way to what art was really about, which was arriving at some kind of truth or insight about the world. Beauty being sort of the great reflection of that. And that the private experience of taste, because I privately, in my experience, lift one idea up or diminish another idea, that was seen as something that was very superficial and really not very important to the artistic experience and to the role of art. Well, the empiricists, again, because of their epistemology, because of the fact that they put all this emphasis on sense experience and the reconsideration and reorganization of sense experience in our mind, give a lot more place to taste within aesthetic experience, and really a lot more place to taste epistemologically, really. There's sort of a long story about that that I'm going to try to abbreviate a little bit with it. It begins, I suppose, with a man named Anthony Cooper, or as he's better known, the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury. Born in 1671, died in 1713, so he didn't have a very long life. But he did have some impact in a lot of this. He was educated by John Locke, the great empiricist philosopher. I don't know if Locke was actually his direct teacher, but Locke was responsible for his teaching, and I'm sure he must have taught him some. But he has some impact on Shaftesbury's thinking. If you look at Shaftesbury's aesthetic theories, one of the things that you see is that he is still, in many ways, more a part of an earlier generation. He is, intellectually speaking, he's primarily interested in giving a Neoplatonic account of beauty and of art. But there is one difference, and this is sort of the Lockean aspect, the empirical aspect that really gets in his thinking and that has its hook there. It's that Shaftesbury also has this way in which he recognizes that there's something he calls an inner eye, or inward eye, I guess. And that inward eye is pleased, or disturbed, depending upon the case, by both ethical and aesthetic senses of rightness. Now, where do these ethical and aesthetic senses of rightness go that our inner eye judges? It comes from our feelings, our experiences, our capacity to make judgments. And we try to do this, according to Shaftesbury, in a disinterested manner. That is, in a way where we look at these senses of rightness, hold them, reflect upon them, consider their rightness or not rightness, but they are constructed by us through and in our own senses. The second figure, and I think in many ways probably a more significant figure for the evolution of taste within the story of empiricism in the 18th century, is a man named Francis Hutcheson, who lives in the first half of the 18th century, 1694 to about 1746 or so. And it's interesting because he is coming into a debate in the second quarter of the 18th century in which questions about taste by these empiricists are really beginning to come up, and not just by philosophers, but by figures in all sorts of different areas, artists, religious figures even in some cases. And a lot of ideas are being thrown out. One of the things that Hutcheson does, though, is that when he's asked about taste, he says that there's a lot of misunderstandings. For one thing, he says, a lot of people will think that taste is a source of, comes from a kind of intellectual satisfaction with things. This is clearly what the rationalists thought. No, he rejects that. He rejects the idea that it comes from a sense of usefulness or utility, that we think things are beautiful or ugly because they're helpful to us in some way. And he rejects that, too, because he says that it doesn't address the kind of immediacy that comes from the experience of taste, that we either like it or we don't like it. We don't have time to see whether it's useful or not useful. We might like that as well, but that's not really what it's about. And he says it's not a matter of associations of ideas, a kind of underlying psychology or subconscious connection that we're making with things. Instead, he says, taste has to do with a kind of immediate encounter with the ratios of uniformity and variation within our senses. Uniformity and variation within our senses. And so, by having this sense of proportion, of a way in which our senses have a collection or sense of ideas, it elicits a particular kind of delight, as he says, in this encounter. Let me tell you a little about what I mean by this, because that seems to me, anyway, a little bit abstract. I like to think of the way that Hutcheson approaches this as a little like that there are recipes, or maybe even formulas, within particular organizations of our senses that when we encounter them, they just boom, they hit us in a certain way at a certain time. Think about coffee, right? Think about drinking coffee. If you have little kids, if you're around little kids, you were a little kid at one time, you ever encounter coffee, I'll tell you what, I have not seen many little kids who like coffee. You give them some coffee, they want to have some coffee because their parents are drinking it, and their faces just, they just hate it, right? But you look around, well, there is a little chain called Starbucks that does pretty well for itself, and they sell coffee. And they don't always sell it with sugar or cream or make macchiatos out of it or whatever it is that they do. A lot of coffee is plain. It's dark, it's bitter, it's awfully hot. How is it that we come to like that? Well, one of the things that happens is we get to a place where we're capable of having a sense of these tastes and appreciating them in some way. Not just having an association, but an appreciation, an immediate appreciation. And the way in which we do that is what Hutcheson is talking about. There is a way in which we can put these senses together, largely around taste, some of it around touch, some of it around smell, some of it around reflections upon sort of higher ideas about this even, of what it all comes to. And from that, we have aesthetic experience and can make, on top of that, aesthetic judgments. And that brings me actually to something else that Hutcheson's pretty important with too. You might think, with all this talk about sense experience and internal reflection upon this, that all this aesthetic experience is entirely relativistic. It's what's mine's mine's, what's yours yours, and never the twain shall meet. And the reason it seems all relativistic is because it's so subjective, right? Well, that's not actually true. It's not to say that there's not a relativistic aspect to it. You can't escape that with the subjectivity that's there. But it is to say that when you talk about aesthetic experience from Hutcheson's point of view, you're in a place where you're talking about a situation where it's possible to explain why it is one set of taste is lifted over another. You can say that this flavor brings out this flavor, that this color reminds us of this mood or this emotion or this set of ideas, and that it puts us in a frame of mind to engage something in a particular way. In other words, you can explain the reasons why it is that a certain aesthetic experience or aesthetic association or organization works. This is important. The last of the British empiricists to talk about aesthetic experience, major British empiricists to talk about aesthetic experience that I want to mention, is probably one of the most important British empiricists to come down the pike, and that's of course David Hume. Hume's philosophy is quite rich, quite subtle, and profoundly important, and I don't really have time to get to it here. I've got some videos that you can look at on my channel with that if you like, but I will say this about Hume's ideas of aesthetic experience in relation to his own thinking. Hume, of course, recognized that our understanding of the world is entirely inductive and seems to be in a state of shifting all the time, that we can't ever hold or remember everything that we've ever experienced, and so we're always in a state of reconsidering and reconsidering and reconsidering. The image that comes to my mind with David Hume is, my mind is like a hand that is holding a pile of sand inside of it, and the sand is always dripping out between my fingers, but I'm always in the state of reaching back down and grabbing more sand as it falls through, and then reaching back down and grabbing it. And this collection of sand that I hold in my hand, well, that's my mind, and each of these little grains of sand is a kind of experience. When you take that to aesthetic experience, one of the things that Hume recognizes is that aesthetic experience actually allows us to do a lot more epistemologically than other forms of experience do, because aesthetic experience is immediate. Aesthetic experience in its immediacy yields pleasure, yields pain, and quite often we can remember what that pleasure and pain is, and from that infer the ways in which we might be stimulated. In other words, aesthetic experience can be something that can be very edifying for us, because we can learn to think about, to consider what might please us or what might displease us, and put ourselves in positions that we might be able to infer from that through aesthetic experience. Art has the capacity to teach us, and it has the capacity to teach us in a way that we wouldn't be able to be taught otherwise for Hume, because of its immediacy, because of its power, and because of just where it hits us within our experience. Last idea I want to bring up here that's very, very important within theories of aesthetic theories, these early modern aesthetic theories from the empiricist point of view, and that is the idea of aesthetic emotions. And in particular, two that get discussed quite a bit by these thinkers, especially later on, the idea of the beautiful, and most importantly, the idea of the sublime. Nobody is more famous for talking about this than a man named Edmund Burke, a philosopher, a political theorist, a famous conservative in the face of the French Revolution. But in his earlier days, he was quite the aesthetician and thinker of aesthetics. And he gives a famous account of how it is that we come to have these emotions and what their role is for us. Let me talk first of all about the idea of the sublime. As you may or may not know, the idea of the sublime is or the experience, the emotion of sublimity, is the experience of awe, of terror, of wonder, of a sense of the raw power that is beyond us in some way, and that fills us with both an experience of wonder, of terror, of helplessness, and gives rise to a whole new set, a wide array of emotions and ideas when we have it, when we encounter it. You know, you think about experience of, I don't know, standing before an ocean, or listening to the power of, let's say Mozart's Requiem Mass, right, as it's kind of reaching its crescendos. There's a sense in which you're filled with these sensibilities, and it moves you. Your heart beats more, your mind races in these different ways. You go into this interesting place where a lot of stuff is kind of exploding in your mind, you know. How does that happen? This is what Burke wants to know. What he says is, well, what happens when we have these aesthetic emotions is this. The artist creates a situation with his work, or her work, in which we are invited to imagine a collection of senses. Not just any collection of senses. It's a collection of senses that brings us to a state of a sense of helplessness in the face of the vast. So we're confronted with a kind of horror, or a kind of vastness, or emptiness, or something like that, where we feel extraordinarily, almost existentially vulnerable. He wouldn't use that term because that's later on, but you get my drift with it. A sense in which we're wholly and completely aware of our limitations through our senses. And it fills us with this deep, deep sense of horror in a kind of way, because we are, as it were, inside of an aesthetic box generated by our imagination, of our own creation, of our own senses. So we have this horror, but it's a controlled horror. And when we put ourselves in a place where we can experience it and then contemplate it, we're given both a sense of relief, a sense of relaxation, and also a kind of edification, a kind of learning, a kind of awareness of this world of sense experience that we have imagined and that we've participated in, inside of our own minds, and of our own senses, that allows us to be better, and to be bigger, to come to be more. Beauty works very much in the same way as the sublime, except instead of focusing on this root of all that is negative and bad and horrible, pain, instead of focusing on that, focuses on pleasure, focuses on things that we desire, things that we delight in, things that give us a sense of ecstasy. And again, our mind dwells within this space, this collection of senses that has been woven through the imagination and allows us to be part of it, right? It does that, and again, edifies it. So, this is what we have. And I guess what I'd leave you with in considering the role of the empiricists in the evolution of early aesthetic theory is this. These guys have an important impact because they put us into a place where we can begin thinking about aesthetics not as the pursuit of truth, but as a realization and opening up of our own minds, of the contents of our own thinking and of our own experience in this world. It's a revelation not just of the world, but of ourselves and ourselves as we encounter the world. In that sense, new ideas, new things under the sun. Kind of interesting.